Welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on the news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson, and for Earth Day this year, we're revisiting a topic that we first covered in 2022 on this podcast, plastic pollution. I think it's now common knowledge that plastic pollution has become a true crisis around the world. Our current system for recycling and reusing plastic products is broken, and far too much of the plastic we use in our lives ends up in our communities or in our oceans. But there is hope for a brighter future. Longtime listeners will recall that back in March of 2022, the UN Environment Assembly agreed to kick off a process to draft a global treaty to end plastic pollution, with the goal of finalizing the treaty by 2025. My guest today is Erin Simon, WWF's Vice President for Plastic Waste and Business. Erin has had a front row seat to this ongoing treaty process, and she's joining us today to provide an update ahead of the critical next hurdle, the fourth meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, which begins on April 23rd and is intended to bring the treaty one step closer to being finalized. Erin's also going to share some updates on the domestic front, including the recent passage of two bills in the U.S. Senate to strengthen America's recycling system, and a call to action for what else we need Congress and the President to do in the months ahead. It's a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. Okay, I am joined now by Erin Simon, WWF's Vice President for Plastic Waste and Business. Erin, welcome back to Nature Breaking.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, before we dive all the way into the UN treaty and some of the other progress we've been seeing in the plastic policy space, I want to just do a quick refresh on the plastic pollution crisis more generally. So the last time we spoke back in 2022, seems like forever ago, you told me that roughly a dump truck of plastic per minute was flowing into nature. And I just have to start by asking, is that still true?
Sadly, yes. I mean, I laugh because it's how I deal with stress, but the plastic pollution levels just sort of continue to rise. That dump truck a minute is continuing to happen, and we're on a path to increase that. A study that came out from Pew, which I think had probably come out when we were talking last, said that we're slated to double the amount of production in less than 20 years.
Yeah.
So if we don't do anything, we're going to face sort of an unfixable environmental, economic, and health cost within a generation.
Wow.
We know that same scale happened in the last 20 years. We doubled production in the past 20 years, and we're only at 9% globally of waste recycled. And there's been a lot of engagement from national and voluntary actions. In fact, if you sort of look over an accounting of those, they've increased by 60% of businesses and governments trying to take action. But at the same time, with all of that action, there's still been an increase in pollution.
Wow.
By over 50%. So, and we talk about that probably at WWF in the form of species and ecosystems and communities, but it's an economic issue.
For sure.
The U.S. spends about $7 billion in lost income and lost revenue from just all of the plastics that are landfilled. It's just a waste.
Yeah, God, that is so wild, and it is absolutely such a waste. So again, before we get all the way into some of the policy stuff, I'm wondering if there's at least been some momentum in terms of maybe public awareness and corporate engagement. I mean, after all, a lot of the plastic that ends up in nature can be traced back to the packaging that companies design and the ways in which we as consumers handle that packaging, right? So has there been any sort of incremental progress on that front?
Yeah, I think we've seen a groundswell across the board. That's always been sort of, I think, the linchpin of engagement around this issue is how visceral everyone's reaction to it is. And in a very similar way, no matter what your background is or where you are in the world, you see plastic in nature and you think it doesn't belong there. Yeah. We recently commissioned a polling on a cross section of Americans, and we found that the majority of Americans, so that's over 85%, think that plastic pollution is a pretty serious and concerning problem. and that requires immediate political action to solve.
That's great.
Most Americans, yeah. I mean, we don't agree on a lot of things in the United States, right?
Sure.
But most Americans would actually support legislative action that enforces corporate accountability on it. They want laws that incentivize companies to reduce plastic waste, to make companies responsible for the plastic waste they create, to penalize companies for creating waste. And what's interesting is that there's support from the business community sort of directionally in this way too. A lot of American companies recognize that without legislation, without government action, plastic pollution and its associated businesses costs, like the business costs, are only going to get worse, right? The risks only get worse. And so these companies are calling for policies that incentivize good behavior and level the playing field, because they need to do more to solve the problem, and they need to have policy to do that. They need the enabling that policies can do. So they see that if they can advance federal policies on plastics waste now, that it will increase the certainty they need for the global rules that could be coming through a treaty today. It can minimize their risks, help with investment, and then truly allow them to start taking advantage of the opportunities the circular economy could provide, because right now it's really tough.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think you hear a lot of people expressing frustration with the amount of plastic that they see on their streets or in their neighborhoods. And I think at some level, a lot of us just want to be able to like go have our cup of coffee on the go and not feel bad about it and not worry where that is going to end up. And so it makes sense that people would be responding in that way, and that then companies would be responding to public opinion in that same way. So that's great to hear, and that maybe lays the groundwork for some progress, which, we can pivot now to some of this policy stuff. And I want to start on the domestic front before we zoom out to the international efforts at the UN. You told me before, a couple of years ago, that there were as many as 15,000 recycling systems in the U.S., which blew my mind at the time. And I know from speaking to you before and just experiencing this in my own life that the different systems, depending on where you live, can cause a lot of confusion about what to recycle, how to recycle, and ultimately that leads to a lot of plastic waste going into landfills. And so WWF and a lot of others have been advocating for some changes on this front, right? We've been asking the U.S. government to take steps to address this and create a more comprehensive national system that's less confusing and more effective. So I want to talk about what we're asking for there. And first off, I mentioned that there has been some progress lately. Just in March, the U.S. Senate passed 2 plastic policy bills. I want to just ask by having you talk a little bit about what those bills would do, and then we can get into some of the other asks that we still have out there for the government.
Yeah, I think it is, we're making some progress because we have this public support, because we have the corporate engagement and advocacy on this to create some consistency and cohesion around all of those different policies that exist in the 50 different states. I think we love to see the states pilot out and try different things in their policies, but it can get really complicated for consumers. It's also really complicated for businesses. I heard in a hearing that I participated in a few weeks ago, the CEO for SC Johnson say, we need federal regulation so we're not overregulated by the states. It becomes really hard for them to sell into 50 different states when it's really different. So the 2 bills that were just passed are sort of what I think of as like great building blocks, some necessary steps that need to be taken as we move towards more cohesive policy. So the Senate recently passed 2 bipartisan bills from the Senate Environment and Public Works, so that's the EPW committee, by Chairman Tom Carper, Ranking Member Senator Shelley Moore Capito, and Senator John Boozman. And what these are going to do is help reduce plastic pollution by investing more in Americans' recycling and composting systems, which we haven't been doing. So the first bill is called the Recycling and Composting Accountability Act, which would direct the Environment Protection Agency, or EPA, to collect more data on recycling and composting. You really need to understand where you're at to know where you're going to go,
sure.
Right? So this is a great act that would allow them to do that study. The second one is called the Recycling Infrastructure and Accessibility Act. And that would give the EPA a pilot program to build infrastructure. So one of the challenges we have in the US is that infrastructure is not equitable, right? There are some places where we don't have recycling at all. And so this would allow grant programs to build infrastructure in rural and underserved communities to test it out. So WWF has been advocating for the passage of both of those bills. And in fact, a week before they were actually passed in the Senate, 61 WWF activists and staff met with members of Congress asking for action to make recycling and composting systems more accessible for all Americans, really targeting those two bills. So we're excited to see that those measures that will make it easier for people to reduce plastic waste. And we hope to see the House pass those bills in a step forward in improving America's waste management. Because I think we talked about this before. I don't want us to give up on recycling. Yeah. I know it's not everything. It is not going to solve plastic pollution on its own, but we need to be able to recycle. We need to be able to reuse. We need to be able to compost. But to do any of those, we need to have the enabling policies in place. And so that's really what we're fighting for, is sort of getting those in place so we can make it easier for everyday people to do it.
I think you're absolutely right. We don't want to give up on recycling. It's going to be at least a big part of the puzzle in terms of how we keep plastic out of nature. But we also can't have a system that causes people to get so frustrated that they just throw up their hands and say, you know what, I'm not even using my blue bin anymore because I don't know if it's actually being recycled. We need to have a system that makes more sense and that people have faith in so that they're using it. And then on the other end of it, the reason they have faith in it is because the things they put in those blue bins are actually getting recycled and not just going to a landfill. So it sounds like those bills would help, right? They're at least a step, an important step in the right direction. Yeah. And I know that the House of Representatives still needs to pass those bills, right? So we hope they'll do that soon and send those to the president. But thinking bigger, beyond those initial steps that are very bipartisan and that hopefully will get done this year, what else are we advocating for on the national scale, either in Congress or thinking about the administration and the White House? What really needs to happen on that scale to fix the recycling system in the U.S.?
So what we are really advocating for is a program called Extended Producer Responsibility, often referred to as EPR. And what this is really a market-driven solution where the government and business sort of share the same goal of building best-in-class recycling systems. It's more of a partnership. What it does is it shifts that responsibility for end-of-life management of products and materials to include the producers of these products.
Okay.
And then the objective is then to share the physical, organizational, and financial responsibility for waste management between producers and the government. Imagine this as supply chains, right? If you can think about a company sourcing any material to make their product, a recycling stream is a new supply chain for them. So you create a partnership between the government and the business on building these supply chains together. And what it does is it creates a much more resourceful and effective structure that can increase the end-of-life collection, therefore allowing for more environmentally sound treatment or management of these collected products and waste, so we can reuse and recycle. And it can also have incentives built into it to design more resource and efficient products and low-impact products.
Interesting.
And then, which is really exciting because that can you can financially incentivize or disincentivize, right? It can be less costly for them to have something recycled that has more environmental benefits. And if it is something that has a higher environmental footprint or has chemicals of concern, it could be a higher cost, right? So use the economic incentives to drive that change. And we know this works. So EPR is responsible for robust recycling rates in countries around the world already. So it's not a new thing. And we see it already creating these powerful incentives for companies to reduce their plastic footprint, design for recyclability, and mitigate the risk of leakage. It allows us to just share that burden with producers. EPR sort of eases the cost of recycling off of the public where it sits now. And we think that the time is ripe for Congress to advance federal legislation on EPR. We've already seen it successful in 4 states, right? We've got California, we've got Colorado, we've got Maine, and Washington.
Okay.
And in all of those cases, you have industry leaders calling for this, and they're calling for federal EPR as a policy solution because it would help the private sector move towards a circular business model. It would help them design more high quality, consistent supply chains for those secondary materials. So that's what happens when something is recycled. It becomes a secondary material market. And so it just becomes more consistent. So it's really, I think we have a chance. We'll see if we can do it, though.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And so it's great that we've got these 4 states that have been piloting this initiative, and I'm sure that we call the states the laboratories of democracy, right? So they're working through the kinks of what works and what doesn't in terms of these EPR systems, and would love to see the federal government take action on that this year.
It does need to go through Congress, but it's such a bipartisan issue because at the end of the day, while we talk about it with outcomes that we want to serve the environment and to serve communities, it's really about dollars and jobs.
Yeah.
We have a lot of money on the line in waste that we're letting go right now, and a lot of the global businesses are asking the U.S. to lead. They're asking the U.S. to develop a system that can be mimicked elsewhere in the world. And so I think there's an opportunity for this to pass because it isn't something that is as divisive. It's something that more people sort of collectively want.
Great. Well, that's a great pivot to thinking more globally. So let's talk about this UN treaty process that's been going on. Last time you were on the podcast, I think the process of drafting this treaty had just been kicked off a couple months earlier in the first half of 2022. And I just would love for you to update us on what's been happening there. So first off, what is this treaty intended to do? What are the goals here, and what are we trying to put in place in terms of a global recycling system or rules for a global recycling system?
So when the world comes together and decides they need a treaty, it's because they have a shared threat, something that they cannot address on their own. So we probably touched on this a few years ago, but that's when there becomes the impetus for the need for that collective global action. Yeah. And you sort of see that same thing happening in a more of a micro situation, if you call the United States a micro situation. But it's saying we all need to work together for circularity. We need to do that globally because these are material supply chains that flow across country borders, right? And so we need to sort of coordinate our approach. We can't all be just taking our linear systems and turning them into a circle. We'll just have a bunch of separate circles. We want to sort of build that larger circular system together. And so the idea is that the treaty can be the global instrument that does this. And World Wildlife Fund has been advocating for a treaty for years, way before the process began, because we saw the need for this collective action early on. And our goal is to advance a treaty that will end plastic pollution and negotiate it by the end of 2024. Okay. So in March of 2022, countries came together and they said, yes, we agree. We are going to negotiate a treaty to end plastic pollution. And we will do it in an accelerated timeline of 2 years. And it should be inclusive of the whole life cycle. So it's not just about waste management. It's not just about recycling. It's about reducing the impacts on humans and the environment for the entire life cycle of plastic, because there is damage throughout the production cycle, as we know for everything. But it is quite intense for plastics throughout the value chain. And so we have been asking for a treaty that creates binding global rules across the entire plastic life cycle. So imagine that the framework that we all abide by, the rules that we all play by, so that we're all pulling the same levers for change to reduce production, consumption, and increase the recovery of those materials. We've been advocating for global rules that get rid of the most harmful and problematic plastic products.
Would that be like single use, or to define that a little bit? What are the most problematic products?
So problematic are usually those materials that they could have one of two problems. One, which is the most common, is that they aren't hard to recycle. That could be things that are really small, and so they don't get recycled, like straws and stir sticks. Yeah. It could also be materials that their color is a problem. So the green Sprite bottle, which is now clear, used to be problematic because the green actually degraded the quality of the clear the PET.
Ah, I didn't know that.
So that's sort of the designing for recycling element of it, right? So either if you can fix it, but if not, stop making it.
Got it.
Straws and stir sticks, for example. But there's also those chemicals of concern, those that when using them create a human health issue, right? That could either be an additive, that could be something in the production process, it could be in the use, or it could be that when it is leaked into nature because it is so problematic, it is really problematic for species and ecosystems. And so that could be like plastic bags, that could be the 6-pack rings, it could be packing bans for seals. These are things that can be really problematic and high risk once they end up in nature. So it's kind of aligning on what are the criteria for how we get rid of these problems, these very harmful or avoidable plastic products. Yeah. And then that leads to design requirements for everything else, right? If you are going to make it, match these design requirements so it can work in the recycling, reuse, and composting systems that are going to be put in globally. And then, of course, you need to have financial support. Right? Because I have said this multiple times, the global north cannot be the only part of the world that is successful in delivering on this. The global south, who is impacted the most, has to be successful, or we haven't solved plastic pollution. Yeah. So we need to create an instrument that has a financial mechanism that helps with investment and capacity building. We need to make sure everybody's feels like they have the ability to deliver on these sort of massive solutions. And so that's what we've been advocating for throughout the process.
Got it. So how would that financial mechanism work? Where would the money come from? Would all the participating governments be paying into a fund to support the global infrastructure we need for this?
So it can be done in a couple of ways. So if you look back on other instruments like Paris, CBD, they all have different sort of financial mechanisms, and that process is still being decided. Yeah. But typically, the investment comes from the larger economies and is distributed to SMEs, but it's usually in partnership with a lot of other sort of financial instruments like the GEF and development banks.
The GEF is the Global Environment Facility, which finances a lot of.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, there is a huge amount of investment that needs to go in, and it needs to be sustained. The key also is that it's not just that initial investment to get infrastructure in places where it's not. But coming back to what we were talking about a bit earlier with expended producer responsibility is you need that investment in the first place to get the infrastructure there. You need to have the design requirements so that all the products going into that will work well in that infrastructure. And then you need to have a policy like EPR that creates a funding model to keep the doors open, right? It is the ability for it to sort of pay as they go and keep that, it's the operating budget for those. So it's all of those that are really important. And that's why you sort of see those outlined in what we think of as the important global set of rules that we have in this mechanism, so that it all works together to create that change and create those viable, sustainable business models for that infrastructure in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's super complicated, so thank you for sort of breaking that down for me. And
oh, no, it's okay.
Entertaining my questions. So, all right, super complicated, but I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of what we're trying to accomplish with this treaty. Where are we at in the process? We're 2 years in. What's been negotiated so far? What does the process look like, and where do things stand today?
Oh, this is the messiest process I've ever observed, I know it has to be messy.
You've really been in the mix on this, right? You've been attending. I think there have been a few. It's been like, what has it been? You tell me, but it's been like every 6 months. There's been a few meetings that have happened over the last couple of years where everyone comes together to negotiate text, and so you've been going to those meetings, and you're really in a great position to tell us what it's been like. So I'm very curious to hear what your experience has been and where things stand today.
Yeah. So after that March 2022 resolution that got adopted, that was this sort of agreement to negotiate, we began this fast pace of Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meetings, which are INCs, and there are 5 of them. Since then, we've had 3.
Okay.
So we were in Uruguay for the first one. We went to Paris for the second one. And in November, we were in Nairobi for the third. In just a few weeks, I'm going to be in Ottawa, Canada for the fourth,
Yes.
and then in South Korea in November for the fifth. So very fast paced. And in the process, yes, I'm watching what it looks like for a very diverse global world to not only agree that there's an issue and a shared threat, but agree on how to solve it. And at times, as a doer in my work life and in my personal life, it is very difficult because you have to really allow the process to play out, and it tests my patience like none other. Yeah. But I'm learning a lot. I also took a class with the UN, which is called the Law of Treaties. So I understand a bit more about why the process is. But I want to start with the premise of I think I mentioned earlier, and I will say this all again, we don't solve crises when we don't come together as a global community. Yep. And that's where this UN process and where a treaty is really important. It's we agree on how we're going to fight this threat. And so it's necessary that we do this, but it's also necessary to find compromise. Yeah. And so in the first meeting, we really determined the rules of the game, how we were going to do this, what we were going to do. And let me be clear, that wasn't even fully finalized. In round 2 in Paris, we started to lay out some of the areas that we thought needed to be focused on, what was going to be in scope. And you really started to see a divide in opinions. You started to see countries asking for a ban, a production cap, all the way, up to that's oil and gas. Yeah. And you saw others saying that's not even in scope. We don't need a treaty at all, basically. Oh, wow. And it was really fascinating and frustrating because it was disheartening at times, because for those of us who had never seen this process before, you're like, you agreed to end plastic pollution.
Yeah. How
do you plan to do it if that's not the way? And knowing as a scientist that even what the most ambitious folks are asking for is not enough, right? Because we, coming from WWF, you were constantly aware of the inadequacies and the small baby steps we're constantly taking for progress, which are still great. And we still want to celebrate them. But also, I know what that cost of inaction is. And so that was hard to watch. But we go into Nairobi, and we really started to see that divisiveness grow when they needed to start coming together. They were supposed to be taking that zero draft, so that's the first version of all of everybody's opinions and thoughts that the chair pulls together, and it delivers it to the member states right before Nairobi, and they come in and they just, a certain number of countries felt unheard. They felt like that their views were not represented, and so we spent a lot of INC3 putting a lot of stuff into the zero draft and making it go from a 10-page document to, I don't know, an 80-page document. Wow. That is an estimate and not at all accurate at the moment. And so what needs to happen in INC4 is they need to pick and choose that text. They need to negotiate. They need to compromise, right? And that's hard, right? Because I want a high ambition. I know what this world needs to end plastic pollution. But I also know that I cannot do it if I don't have large producing countries at the table, right? Those are the ones who are producing. They are putting the product onto the marketplace. The United States is one of the largest producers of plastic pollution. They also have 50% of the largest users. And they're in the negotiations, but, it's hard. So we're, in Nairobi, we saw it kind of stall. And now what we're hoping to see in Ottawa, and what we're hoping to see if we have a chance to finish this in 2024, is them come together and find where they agree. Not that we are expecting them to agree on everything, but what are those big major mechanisms we know they need to agree on? We need to end with some global guidelines, right? We need to have those global rules that guide us all. And what can we agree on for those? We also know that there are going to be things that are going to need to be discussed from a technical perspective further into the future. And so we're going to need to get those kind of set up to be a part of the COPs, so the conferences of parties, which happen after the treaty is ratified. Yep. But yeah, we don't want to continue to perpetuate the problem. And so we need to do that. But to negotiate, we need to see strong political will from all countries and we need to speak for the commitment that we made, which was to end plastic pollution, and find where this treaty can be the mechanism to allow that to happen. So I continue to be hopeful and optimistic because I know that there is a desire for countries holistically to finish this in 2024. The hope is that it's something useful in 2024.
Yeah. No, but I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and I totally understand the urgency to get this done, even if it is not perfect in everyone's eyes, to be able to get a treaty over the finish line to make some progress. And I don't know if this is a perfect corollary, but I know as an example that I think a lot of people are familiar with, the Paris Agreement, when it was passed or agreed to in 2015, there was a process that takes place every year where the parties come together and meet and talk about how they can increase ambition year over year. So what was agreed to in 2015 was sort of the baseline, and countries have been working to strengthen it since then, and that is indeed happened in some ways. So would it be kind of a similar process once we get to the implementation side of a plastic treaty, where getting the treaty done this year and in place is the first step, and then we actually have to keep thinking about it and working together to put it into practice and to see what's working and what's not and what changes need to be made over time? Is that how the process would work?
Yeah, it's actually right. Yeah, they kind of build in, they call it start and strengthen. So what do you build in that everybody agrees on for the ratification process? And then once countries ratify, they become a party to the treaty.
Yeah.
So that's why it's called the Conference of Parties. And so only those who have ratified are at the table as decision makers moving forward to start and strengthen that treaty. So if they haven't ratified, they can just be an observer or a non-party to the treaty.
Yep. Yeah, I know that the United States has not ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, so we're only an observer when those meetings happen. And so there would end up, thinking back to the U.S., there would need to be a process if this treaty gets in place at the UN level. The U.S. and other governments around the world would have to ratify it, right? So the U.S. Senate would have to have a vote on this at some point.
Yeah. Congress would have to agree to it. And so that it can be challenging too, because the government agency that negotiates a treaty in the U.S. is the State Department. But the State Department doesn't have the authority to write legislation.
Yeah.
So the State Department can't negotiate a treaty that has policies that don't exist in the U.S. So that's why it's important for us to get things like extended producer responsibility moving in Congress, because it allows the policy to lead and the treaty to come second.
Yeah.
Because it won't work the other way around. Or it couldn't be an element of the instrument if not. The U.S. couldn't ratify, and the U.S. really needs to ratify.
Yeah.
I think that's important to say, just because of the role they play in the full production and use of plastic, they need to be a party.
Completely. And thank you for sort of bringing that full circle, because we started talking about these U.S. policies we're advocating for, and then kind of talking about this UN thing on a separate track. But you just perfectly described how this actually all fits together, and we need one to have the other, and vice versa.
Totally.
Well, I know we've got just...
Yeah, it's a constant feedback loop.
Yeah. I know we've got just a couple minutes left, so I'll let you go shortly, but I wanted to just end on a slightly lighter note, and I wanted to just ask what motivates you on a personal level to tackle these issues, Erin, and I'm curious what steps you've taken in your own personal life to reduce your household's contributions to plastic waste, because I think hearing from an expert like you, what steps you're trying to take might help non-experts like me and our listeners think about how we can make a difference as well.
So I think I'm motivated by a number of things. Personally motivated. I have a child. I have a daughter. She's 13. Well, almost 13. She'll be 13 next week.
Congratulations.
You feel accountable to that, right? I look at the world that we are, not only what we're setting up for them, but the policies that we're putting into place, those things that by taking steps now will make the world better for them, So that is, that's personal. To me, I also just see so much possibility. We have the solutions at our fingertips for this one. this is not it's complicated. It's hard because of preconceived notions and boundaries that are already set up, but it's not hard because it's not possible. And so from my perspective, I just feel like we have this really sort of once in a lifetime opportunity where you have everybody at the table. We know we have the solutions. Everybody agrees that nobody wants trash outside, right? So that drives me a lot. We take a lot of steps in my house all the time. I try to reduce all the single-use plastic that we have. In fact, we actually don't have a lot. We don't even have trash bags. We use a reusable trash bag, which was an interesting journey for us as a household, but turned to work out. I also, because I have a kid, I've played with a lot of reusable containers. I need it to be easy. Just because I want more for the planet doesn't mean I, as a parent with two working parents in this household and a kid, that I have all the time in the world, right? So got a lot of different reuse solutions that we figured out. My daughter is also kind of an advocate for this. She and the girls at her school got rid of single-use cutlery and got a washing machine working, so they no longer have single-use cutlery at their school. Cool. She does spends a lot of time educating people on recycling in our neighborhood, so they don't wish cycle.
Yep.
She actually created printouts. You think we tell our kids to do this stuff, but it turns out they just become sort of impassioned on their own and roll with it.
That's great.
She's run a number of campaigns on her own. But yeah, I think, I understand the risks. We've got to start someplace, and I want to be able to give people accessible ideas, right? At the end of the day, you don't have to be perfect. If all you do is start by cleaning up the trash when you see it outside, and maybe looking around your kitchen and thinking, what is one thing that I could test out a different solution for? You will be surprised how exciting it gets when you figure out something. And, I remember the last time we had a Ziploc in our house. And I was like, oh, we're done. You don't need those. We have solutions. We have all kinds of ideas, and I'm not saying anything against that, but that's just one example of a single-use plastic that I don't have to use at all. So, yeah, I think it can be a personal challenge, or, one that empowers you further, especially in light of the fact that I'm still working on getting the recycling system to work for everybody. Yeah. So until then, just take your own steps where you can.
Yeah, fighting the battle on both fronts.
So,
well, Erin, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. This is a great conversation. This is a super interesting issue. And I think it's great that we're shining a light on this heading into Earth Day. And this episode will be coming out just a few days before that next INC meeting in Ottawa. So good luck there. We are hoping for a good solution or a good outcome. And fingers crossed for you and all of your colleagues.
Me too. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right, that's all for today's episode. My thanks to Erin for her time and expertise, and a big thanks to you, our audience, for listening and engaging on this important topic. This Earth Day, I hope you'll take Erin's words to heart and think about one step you can take in your own life to stem the flow of plastic waste, whether that's through your own actions or by calling your members of Congress to urge them to pass legislation to transform the ways we utilize, recycle, and dispose of plastic. Together, let's keep building a more sustainable future.